So one thing I really wanted to talk about was the concept of instructor pitfalls. So I feel like that's something that we can, in EMS, we always learn from our mistakes as a provider, but I think the same thing is applicable to us as an instructor. So what are some things you think that are, pitfalls of being an instructor?
Welcome to Profess EMS, the podcast dedicated to educating, training, mentoring, and inspiring EMS educators and providers alike. Whether you're looking to grow as an educator or prosper as a provider, sit back, open those neural pathways, and let's get to it.
They're not pitfalls of being an instructor, but some pitfalls for instructors.
I think my biggest one is a lack of preparation. And I know that there is some, I guess, one of those things where it's just like you don't know what you don't know type of situations. One of the biggest things that I find that a lot of instructors rely on is their experience and their current knowledge, as opposed to what that student needs to learn in that situation. So, just talking about cardiac output, as opposed to really thinking about how do I want to build on top of this topic so it's actually understandable. So I think that's one of my biggest pitfalls for instructors is how to properly plan how you're going to teach something as opposed to just walking into the room and just start talking about it.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that there's a lot of instructors rely on a canned product. They're like, well, I'll get this PowerPoint and I'll be able to read off of it and just relate personal experiences, and everybody's going to love what I hear to say. But yeah, when they come into class, that's one of the things that probably is my biggest annoyance with instructors is they come in, they start presenting, and next thing you know, they turn their head, they're looking at the presentation, and that's the first time they've ever seen the words or the graphics on that, and then they take a minute to read it, process it, and then go. There is no consistent flow to it whatsoever. They're just banking it on well, hey, I'll know stuff. I'll know how to tell them something.
Hmm.
And then they go and obviously they get to a bullet point or something they don't know anything about or they weren't prepared for, and then they just completely skip it.
Hmm. I think that's. Um, I wonder if it's just something that's not taught or practiced particularly. Like when an educator is going through orientation, I guess my thought is I wonder how many um, orientees are being taught to do this as opposed to here's the PowerPoints and I'm going to watch you teach it first time, give you a couple pointers, and then you're off to the races, as opposed to showing them how to, for a lack of a better term, lesson plan. And I think that's a really key piece. Even when I'm teaching a case study online or doing live and online, I still have an outline for how I want to methodically approach each individual piece. So for today, we're doing a one on pneumothorax, and I literally have on my sheet is talk about lung physiology and pleural space physiology before I start getting into pneumothorax and the definition of that and how to progress to those things. And so I'm still doing it as an instructor that's been teaching for over a decade, almost a decade and a half, and I still approach it the same way to make sure that when I teach a lesson, it is consumable for that student. And if you commit to that, it makes your ability of an instructor just so much or your ceiling is so much higher if you're putting that commitment into it.
I agree completely. In grad school, so I mean, in my initial instructor training I ever did, we talk about, or you mentioned like the onboarding and what you're being taught. Well, that's one thing that's, I've understood in a lot of classes I've taken is that mindset or kind of like the psychological perspective that people teach the way that they were taught. So
Hmm.
if their exposure to in their instructor training or like their onboarding or the orientation, if they have a very small exposure to instructing styles, they're only going to emulate that.
Mhm.
So like in my graduate studies, that was, a big thing, not only with, preparatory things, but of delivery things. And that concept was mentioned, numerous times throughout studies and research on people just regurgitating and just emulating their previous instructors. But yeah, and in the preparation for it, like you said, building your stuff out, there's numerous titles or people who've labeled a preparatory phase of how they prep, whether they build out a lesson plan and then go to a presentation, or people who can build it backwards. I'm a
Mhm.
person who kind of builds it backwards. I start basically using a presentation as a mold and use that kind of as my lesson plan, and then create the flow of how I want things to go in that. And then I'll write basically the lesson plan of that and kind of going in that sequence that way. So everybody has their style, but I think it's just, as we said, that's such a big pitfall is that preparation into it. Now, I mean,
Mhm.
when I was a new instructor, yeah, I was given, you're just learning how to walk. So it was given a canned product here, go deliver this, work on your delivery things. And then as education continued on, it was learning how to build your own curriculum and your own presentations and going through that way. But yeah, ultimately, you gotta know what you're going to be presenting one way or the other, whether you build it or you've reviewed what you're about to present. Like at some institutions, they don't want you to deviate away from a standard. So they may have something that needs delivered out, but you still have to review it and just be ready for the day. Because
Mhm.
same thing, you go into shift. We go and check out our apparatus at the beginning of the shift to get ready for the day. The same thing should apply to us as instructors.
Totally agree. And you can even like to even put that into context that everyone can understand is that your instructor probably taught you that you can't give nitro to an inferior infarct. And those that mindset or that lesson, just that specific sentence, we see that in comments when we talk about it in our lives and in our discussions, and you can tell that that has been told to them, let's say 5 years ago, and they've never forgot that concept regardless of how much evidence is out there that sometimes the contrary is true. And so your words and the way that you deliver things, regardless of maybe it was accurate 5 years ago, and so to no fault of their own or yours as an instructor, that lesson or those words that you say to that student resonate for years. And I love what you said, Ben, about that those students are going to continue to teach the way that they were taught, and those new instructors are going to teach the way that they were taught as well. And if we continue to use that, then it's never going to evolve, or at least at the mass that we're looking for.
Yeah, I had a close friend who's recently retired, and he referred to that idea as educational inbred.
Hmm.
That it's all just staying in a tight knit. It's never being, deviated away. So he first brought that up and said educational inbred, and he said it to me. I was like, "What?" Like it kind of was almost a punch in the gut. Like, are you saying that I'm inbred? And you're like, no, no, no. It's a concept of people who are staying in their educational realm. They're only just regurgitating the same amount of knowledge, the same amount of information, and just the same thing gets recirculated over and over and over again.
Hmm.
Like, and you said the nitro and inferior stimmies, the same thing applied that not that many years ago, it feels like, that people were saying that, well, you can't give too much oxygen, that's not a thing, just give everybody oxygen. And if that's that same information that's ever being shared and those instructors don't diversify themselves to truly be prepared, then yeah, we're right back into just recirculating the same bad knowledge over and over again.
Mm, it's so true. Well, I guess the question that I have for you, uh, Masters of Education Ben, is how do you break that mold? So let's say there's an educator that's listening to this right now and be like, holy crap, I'm doing that. How can I be better? So how do we break that mold? What are some steps that they can take in order to change?
think getting out and going to conferences, going to any class that you can, even if you know the instructor, it's someplace close and it's really small, go and see how other people present.
Mhm.
Stay, you know, advocate for the industry, advocate for education, and just try to be on top of everything. So that's one thing I think that's helped me is being able to like travel, go to conferences and see uh and being involved in research and reading research so that you kind of know what's coming, that you
Mhm.
try to stay a couple steps ahead. So going to these conferences and seeing some of these people who maybe present or speak professionally of delivery concepts they use or how they're doing things, or just thinking about classes that you felt really engaged in and how that worked for you, or just seeing these classes that everybody start commenting and interacting in. Basically just seeing how a lot of other people do it, of breaking out away from your traditional boundaries where you go to take training. Yeah, we know that there's, you know, institutions that are out there that you can go and get a class to check a box. But we need to get beyond just checking those boxes to say, well, this is training I had to get. This is an easy way for me to do it. Sometimes we just really need to begin to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
I like that. And even I think that it's packaged like more exposure to different styles is going to help you develop your own, because you're going to say things when you're watching these people from that perspective, like, oh, I'm not sure I like the way that they delivered that. And then you see another person that teaches the exact same concept, but in a different way, and you go, oh yeah, I love the way that they explain that, and you pull that in. So yeah, I totally agree, is that the more exposure you have to different teaching styles, the more you're going to be able to emulate those things. And you don't, sometimes you don't have to go to conferences. There are good YouTubers out there, there's good people on social media that deliver good education, and you might have to venture outside just paramedicine for a wide variety of them, and looking at how respiratory therapists teach each other, how nurses teach each other, how physicians teach each other. There are a lot of good ones. There's a lot of not great ones, but there's a lot of good ones. And watching not great ones is can be just as valuable to learn that you don't want to do those things and you want to improve on the way that they do things. So take a lot of stock in that. And just when you're watching something, instead of watching it just to learn the knowledge from it, take away the ways that they're teaching, how they're approaching things. What do they teach first, as opposed to what is the final lesson? There's a lot to learn there, from an educator standpoint, and getting as much exposure as you can to similar topics so you can understand what's possible for you. I mean, even with playing with Play Doh, I was one of the first to do that in our space, but I wasn't the first to ever do that from an education standpoint. And so on social media, I play with a lot of Play-Doh to teach pharmacology. And now I'm starting to see EMS educators take pictures and send them to us, showing that they are now using Play-Doh as a way to teach pharmacology, which I think is a great thing. It doesn't hurt me to say, oh, they're stealing that. No, they're emulating something that works. And that is what a strong educator does.
We've talked about the, using those different delivery methods of, presenting stuff online, using Play-Doh, and just seeing how other people do it. So there, we're kind of looking for delivery methods now. So let's talk on that. So what do you think are some pitfalls when it comes to actual delivery or presentation of the material?
Sure. So teaching delivery, I think one of the biggest things that I see is the over addition. How do I want to say it? The biggest thing that I see that becomes a big problem is how many words you put on a slide. And when you do that, there's two things that happen. Is one, because you put it on the slide, your brain doesn't feel the need to prepare for it. Like, you're not going to be like, okay, I have it on the slide, which means that I don't need to expand on it. Or annotate or illustrate what those things mean. And so you're decreasing the lack of preparation that you perceive to need. The second thing that it does, because you're not preparing as much for it, because it's all on the slide, is that you tend to read off the slide. And so, what I would challenge educators to do in those situations is, instead of having, a bunch of information on those slides, is take that information and put it in the notes of your slides. So that way you can still use them to refer, but you're relied upon as the instructor to teach the concept, as opposed to just reading the concept from what you've put on the slides. I think that's one of my biggest pitfalls, from an instructor, is that, uh, and it comes back to the lack of preparation, but having too much on your slides impacts how much the student is going to pay attention to you, because in their mind they go, all the information is there, they didn't teach me anything more, so all I need to do is make sure that I get a copy of these slides and I'm good. And those become pitfalls or crutches for an instructor, is having too much on those slides that they just simply rely on them.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, going back to that canned product thing of that's is a big hindrance when you have basically a whole bunch of words on a screen and then the instructor essentially they're just reading from the screen. So they're making your educational time story time. It just goes
Mhm.
back to like you're in kindergarten and the teacher has a book and they're reading it out loud to you. That's all that is. If you have presentations to where it has all those words on it, in the early days of online education, that's what instructors would do is take their PowerPoints, upload it online, and then that was enough material that the student could actually study from them. But we are the sage on the stage, if you will. So we are disseminating education. And we're using that PowerPoint as a tool, not as a script to read from. So if we have a presentation that we're able to put online and a student be able to look at it and learn and study from that, that's no different than giving them the textbook.
Mhm.
So if they need to read stuff, they have the book. So yeah, absolutely. It's a thing that's clicked in my head about other things that I was want to talk about on future podcasts, but just that idea of a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Mhm.
And then there it ties into the concept of cognitive load theory. Okay, so and what that is, say we're responding to that call and we want to turn down the radio so we can read the house numbers better, right? Our brain can only process so much stuff at a time. So that goes into the same thing in class. If you have words on a screen and the instructor is talking, I'm going to be reading those words and trying to hear the instructor at the same time, which will never work. So you're almost just better off to not even look at the instructor if they're going to be reading that and just be listening to them. Because if you're trying to, you can read much faster than you can speak. So trying to read the words and then the instructor reading them out loud to you, your brain doesn't process both of those things as well as it would one of them isolated.
Mhm. Love it. Like, it's so incredibly true. That's like the concept of your students are turning down the instructor's volume to read. And
Yes.
same kind of a concept of like, try. I didn't. It's funny how so many people do that, and I do it. I totally turn down my music to squint at the house numbers. I do it all the time. Even when I went downtown and I'm like in the ambulance, I'm like, oh my god, I got to pay attention. I turn off the music because I just can't handle that much cognitive load at the same time with that ambulance. Like, it's kind of funny. But the concept of that is real, and we live it every day.
Oh, absolutely. And then I think another thing with delivery is, the instructor, if they are thinking that they are that sage on the stage, that they're up there, storytelling and maybe not trying to actually, help formulate education. They're just disseminating the knowledge that they know. They're
Hmm.
trying to sometimes just tell you how much they know instead of, engaging the students, evaluating that they've actually comprehended it. I mean, just to look across the room and see people going, like giving a head nod, that doesn't do anything. So actually creating an engaging classroom, which is hard in the social environment when you're recording things. Like for me, that is very hard to, you know, be in my basement recording and it's just me and a camera and lights down there, of not getting that feedback, because I'm so reliant on getting that feedback from students and engaging with them. And then it kind of just, steers how your lesson plan goes for that day, of what the students are asking. Are they understanding the concepts? Are they, thinking about it or applying it in scenarios that they've seen? So I think, the delivery needs to be more of a involvement than
Mhm.
just a delivery of what's on the screen.
Totally agree.
All right. So when it comes time to, putting everything in uh full perspective, what about an educator? Like, what are some methods you use to, like, if you have a live audience, of how you are assessing that they actually got the information that you were trying to disseminate?
So I don't speak in front of a classroom very often, but I still use the same concept when I speak on stage. When I'm talking about a certain topic, one of the first things that I like to do is identify who's actually giving me eye contact. And so that at least tells me that I've captured their attention, as opposed to someone that's got their, hand on their head, or they're kind of looking down and looking back up um, from their phone. Or do I see people taking notes? Because taking notes, at least for me, tells them that they're identifying certain things that they should be learning. So that's the first thing that I'm looking for, is just how is their body language in relation to what I'm saying. The next thing that think every educator should focus on is feedback on questions. And so within your slides, after you discuss a concept, using a short case study with a question in order to identify if they understood the concept that you spoke of. So, for example, cardiac output, and you're speaking and teaching about cardiac output, and then you put it in the context of a case study of you're dispatched to a 90-year-old or 80-year-old congestive heart failure patient. And the question can be as simple as, in congestive heart failure patients, is cardiac output decreased? And the answer being yes or no. And then if you want to go a level layer or a level lower and take another layer of it, like, what part of cardiac output is impacted? Is it the heart rate that's the cause of the issue, or is it the stroke volume that's the cause of an issue? And then you can continue to pull off layers of questions in order to identify how well your students are understanding that concept. So I think that those types of feedback questions are invaluable to identify if your students really understand a concept.
Oh, most definitely, especially in emergency services as a whole. Because as I've said multiple times, there are two types of people in EMS: those who have ADHD or those who are yet to be diagnosed. Right. So we got to create a way to keep that attention. And there's a lot of research talking about changing up methods of delivery at least every like 10 to 15 minutes. So, ensuring that we are creating some way to engage them. So even if, you have a large audience of, doing a hands up vote, yes or no, like finding some way to get them. Um, I'm just a big fan of, when I teach, asking a lot of questions. Just like, all
Mhm.
right, so if we have this happening, what would we see? Or hey, let's say in a pneumothorax, since that's on, like upcoming case study, when would it become, what are some things that you would see in a tension pneumothorax versus a simple pneumothorax? And then I'll wait for questions to come in or comments. And then, kind of, if students give a question like, well, you see JVD, great. Why do you see JVD?
Mhm.
Um, you'll hear, they'll have hypotension. Cool. What's causing the hypotension? So just kind of use questions to formulate, group discussions. Now, if you're in a room full of, hundreds of people and presenting, that's a little bit more difficult. So that's where you can rely on like the body language and simple more engagement things like hands up, voting yes, no, true, false, kind of things like that. But involving that classroom helps a lot.
Hmm.
So, what are some experiences that you've had that you think that have maybe really helped your mindset as an educator, or like something great that you feel like that has changed as an educator, and something you realize it was a mistake that you made as an educator?
I'll start with a mistake. Um, One of the biggest things that I used to do is assume that concepts that I felt were simple were understood. Now, and going back to that cardiac output concept, is that if I'm talking about congestive heart failure and then I start talking about in the context of like how cardiac output is impacted, if I've assumed that all of my students understand the concept of cardiac output and I just blow over that in my congestive heart failure talk and assume that they all get like understand that concept, that has put me behind the eight ball of understanding. So I think that just because you feel that it's an easy concept to understand for yourself, if you assume that it's the same for all of your students, that can get you in trouble because y- we've talked about kind of the preparation of scaffolding things and putting things and layering things on top of each other. And so if you're assuming that a concept is understood and you're moving on to more complex related concepts, then your students are going to fall behind not just one step, but maybe two or three steps if you're making those assumptions. And so you need to always make sure that you are confirming knowledge before you move on. Now, that can be in the way of using review questions to make sure that your students are answering that question appropriately. Of, okay, they get cardiac output. Now, let's talk about the pathophysiology of congestive heart failure. So, making sure that you don't make assumptions like that is really important, especially if you're not the only one teaching that program and assuming that the previous instructor that taught those concepts taught it well and made sure that that concept got through to all the students. Now, once you start to understand how other instructors teach and they consistently proven that they can teach a certain concept, maybe you can make a couple assumptions based on those experiences. But until then, you gotta assume that your student is starting at zero until you've proven otherwise. And so make sure you're not assuming things. And that was a mistake that I used to make when I used to teach even pharmacology with master medics, is that I assumed that they understood the physiology of receptors and neurotransmitters, where I noticed that people weren't understanding the things that I was teaching because they didn't understand those concepts. And so in videos, you can see the change that I make where I now start the videos talking about basic receptor um, physiology and neurotransmitter physiology before I get into the concept of how the medications alter those things. And it was because I assumed too much in what my students knew as a whole. That kind of leads into the thing that I've changed a lot of is by assuming nothing that has changed the way that I teach. Even if I, and it just allows me to, or reminds me to take 30 seconds to go back to those simple concepts that I assume they all know, because if I'm assuming it, it's probably not true. Um, and I make sure that I take the 30 seconds or 1 minute to review those simple concepts before I move on, even if I've taught it 10 times before. So that way I know that I've given my students the chance to at least review that in their minds. Maybe it's been a while, and at least reviews it in their mind so that way they can continue to keep up with what you're teaching.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, it made my brain start going of, and it's ironic that you say the cardiac output because in a video lesson I recorded yesterday, I had realized once I got into it, I kept talking about cardiac output, cardiac output. It was one I'd recorded a while back, and I had to redo it because I kept mentioning cardiac output, and I realized that I never went through and explained that what I thought was a basic concept of cardiac output.
Hmm.
And that ties into things I think about with, say, youth sports. All my kids are involved in sports, and from like a coaching side of things, that's one thing I've never liked in youth sports is they assume that if they say, basketball, hey, set a pick, that all those kids know what a pick is, or they'll
Hmm.
start saying words or phrases without ensuring that those kids understand what a pick is, what pick and roll means, what, getting in a triple threat position means. They'll yell at them and expect them to know this, but when they don't, then they can end up getting in trouble because they don't know it, but that nobody ever made sure that they did know the basics and the fundamentals. So I agree completely. I feel like if it is um, even if you realize it during your presentation or discussion, if you have said a phrase, making sure that everybody understands it. So if you brought up cardiac output in front of a live audience, you could say, okay, now, well, what is cardiac output? To let that little kind of discussion happen. If not, if there is no live audience, you got to make sure that the phrases you're using have that baseline has been established, that
Hmm.
all those fundamental things that you are ensuring instead of assuming that they know, because we all know what they say about assuming, right? It makes that out of you and me.
Hmm.
And I think so from my perspective of mistakes that I think I've made, it ties into that as well of just rambling or, in my initial years as an educator of trying to say too big of words. I don't want to say that like trying to dumb it down, but I would say, more of a advanced medical terminology without ensuring that they know that. And then, and sometimes there's those students that just catch your attention and make you realize that you've goofed up. Like, I could have been saying the same word over and over and over again. And finally, one student's like, hey, what's that mean? Like, what? You don't know that? And it's like, oh gosh, well, I've been, using this word for weeks and you didn't realize you did know it. So I think that kind of helped me. One of my initial mistakes that applies in where my growth is engaging the students instead of just telling them things and then assessing it on a quiz, of doing that continual assessment to make sure that I'm getting out the information as I need to and they're actually understanding what I'm saying. Um, and just finding those ways to present and be more animated. I still struggle with that daily of, not being as monotone. Like I was watching one of your videos and you're a lot more moving and using your hands. And I feel like that I kind of get a lot more still and I don't move as much. Maybe it's because I got these big long arms and big hands and it
They
just
always
looks
end up out
weird.
of frame.
Yeah, I always look like a I always look like the inflatable arm waving guy whenever I'm up moving around. But yeah, finding ways to be more engaging and more active, and creating a means of storytelling as well instead of bedtime stories.
Hmm. Love it.